The black void of space held its breath as the Endeavor approached the derelict station, its battered hull a dark scar against the backdrop of stars. Commander Reed Keller stood at the helm, eyes locked on the station's silhouette as the ship's proximity alarms whispered warnings. He clenched his jaw, the quiet droning of machinery around him matched only by the restless pulse in his temple. Docking in 30 seconds, Lieutenant Rhea Patel's voice was steady, though a tremor of unease rippled beneath her words. The crew's apprehension was palpable, shared in the exchanged glances and the nervous tics that betrayed their discipline. They had traveled light years on a thread of a signal, something so fragmented that even their most advanced systems could barely decipher it. It called like a siren, urging them to come, to see, to understand. The docking clamps engaged with a shudder, metal grinding against metal as the ship latched onto the station's ancient airlock. The silence that followed was dense, almost sentient. Keller motioned to the team, their helmets reflecting the ghostly glow of the ship's dim lights. Each member was a seasoned explorer of the void, but here, before this structure that seemed neither dead nor alive, they looked as fragile as any mortal. "Ready?" Keller's voice, modulated through the comms, sounded distant. Patel nodded, a flicker of fear darting across her brown eyes before she steeled herself. The rest of the team assembled, a formation drilled into them over countless missions. They were prepared for anything, or so they believed. The outer hatch hissed, and the smell hit first, a stale metallic tang mixed with something sickly sweet, as if decay itself had crystallized in the stagnant air. The narrow passageway that greeted them was lined with jagged seams where pieces of the station's walls had fused and cracked over time. Lights sputtered overhead, casting sporadic flashes that seemed almost sentient, shadows leaping in the corner of their eyes. Keller stepped inside, the dull clang of his boots breaking the silence. The hall felt impossibly long, curving as if guiding them deeper into some labyrinthine heart. The structure was wrong, asymmetrical, as if designed by a mind that had abandoned human logic. Veins of metallic vines clung to the ceiling and walls, gleaming with a dull, oily sheen. Patel stopped, eyes fixed on the strands. "This isn't just old wiring," she murmured, gloved fingers tracing the pulsing lines. "It's biological." Keller's brows furrowed. The notion sent a chill racing down his spine, but he pushed it aside. "Keep moving," he ordered, voice sharper than he intended. The team moved as one, passing through hallways that whispered back to them, echoes stretching longer than they should. Something in the atmosphere weighed them down, as if unseen hands pressed on their chests. They reached an antechamber, a cavernous space where remnants of an old command station jutted out from the floor like ribs of a long-dead beast. Consoles with dark, cracked screens stood in silent witness to their arrival. Patel ran a scanner across one, only to have the device short-circuit with a hiss and a pop. "Electromagnetic interference is off the charts," Engineer Isaac Roy grumbled, tapping on his own readout. His eyes darted around, suspicion etched into his features. Keller nodded, his own thoughts a tumult. The silence was too deep, too calculating. He opened his mouth to give an order when a faint vibration coursed through the floor, a low, droning hum that seemed to originate from deep within the station. It resonated up through his boots, setting his teeth on edge. Patel's gaze turned to him, pupils wide, lips parted as if to speak. But no words came, only the hum growing louder, weaving around them like a living thing. And for the first time in his career, Keller felt a primitive fear gnaw at the edges of his resolve. Before he could react, the flickering lights overhead steadied, bathing the room in a pale, sickly glow. Lines of alien glyphs carved into the walls ignited, bathing the chamber in searing blue luminescence. A sound, almost a sigh, escaped from the structure around them, as though it had been holding its breath for centuries, and finally exhaled. "Commander, I think it knows we're here," Patel whispered, her voice barely more than a shiver of sound. Keller's throat tightened, the silence snapping into sharp focus as the hum ceased. The station's ancient halls, once dormant, had awakened. And so, with the silent welcome complete, their nightmare began. The corridor led them deeper into the bowels of the station, where the air thickened with a strange dampness that clung to their suits and fogged their visors. Commander Keller's breathing came in measured, shallow gasps as he advanced, each step echoing like the ticking of a clock counting down. The oppressive silence amplified every creak, every rustle of their movement, until it felt as though the station itself were alive, listening and waiting. "Scans are picking up an energy surge ahead," Patel said, her voice tight. The glow of her visor illuminated her face, casting deep shadows under her eyes. They looked as if they hadn't known rest in days, and Keller knew that exhaustion, fear's handmaiden, was starting to take its toll on all of them. The narrow passage opened up without warning, and they found themselves standing on the threshold of an immense chamber. The air was colder here, biting even through their protective suits. Keller's eyes swept the room, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dimness and revealing an eerie scene. Black, fibrous tendrils crisscrossed the walls and ceiling, webbed with a viscous substance that glistened in the light. At the center of the room stood a massive cylindrical tank, embedded in the floor and stretching up into the darkness above. Its glass surface was clouded and streaked with a strange bioluminescent fluid that pulsed faintly, casting an otherworldly glow. Suspended inside was a creature that defied comprehension. Patel approached, her breath audible as it quickened. "I've never seen anything like this." Her voice was equal parts wonder and terror. The being inside was both delicate and grotesque, a thing of sinew and chitinous plates, with limbs jointed at bizarre angles. Its translucent skin revealed veins coursing with a bluish liquid that seemed to writhe with a life of its own. But what drew their eyes, what rooted them in a paralyzing awe, were the eyes. Hundreds of them, pinpricks of white light embedded across the creature's body, all staring back. Keller swallowed hard, fighting the urge to look away. Those eyes were not blank. They were watchful, conscious, and calculating. Isaac Roy, standing at the rear of the group, shifted uneasily, fingers twitching near the holster at his hip. "Commander, this isn't stasis, this is containment," he said, voice cracking slightly. The room seemed to respond, a low vibration thrumming through the floor beneath their feet, rattling the ancient consoles and sending motes of dust cascading from the ceiling. The glyphs that had lined the walls in the hallway blazed to life once more, casting a sickly blue light that made the shadows dance with malevolent glee. Patel's hand hovered near the tank, mesmerized by the creature's alien form. She didn't notice when the condensation on the glass began to thin, revealing fractures that widened with an audible creak. Keller's eyes darted to her, a shout forming in his throat. "Rhea, step back now!" But the warning came too late. A crack split the glass, jagged and sudden, spreading like lightning. The containment shattered with a hiss that reverberated through the chamber, expelling a wave of frigid, putrid mist. Keller staggered backward as a stench hit them, sharp and metallic, tasting of copper and rot. A silence fell, thick and suffocating, as the creature slithered free. Its limbs unfurled in a grotesque ballet, each joint clicking into place with a precision that spoke of unearthly biology. Eyes, so many eyes, rotated independently, focusing on each crew member. The room pulsed with an ambient, thrumming energy that raised the hair on Keller's neck. Patel was frozen in place, eyes wide, a silent scream trapped in her throat as the creature's limb shot forward, a tendril so thin it seemed made of shadow itself. It coiled around her neck, lifting her effortlessly as she gasped, boots kicking against the air. Keller could do nothing but watch, paralyzed by the suddenness of the attack, the sheer speed with which the creature moved. Roy fired first, a shot that blazed and illuminated the room in a momentary flash. The bolt struck true, but fizzled out harmlessly against the creature's hide, dispersing in a ripple of dark, chitinous segments. It didn't recoil, it didn't even flinch. Instead, it tilted one eye, a large, slitted orb, toward Roy, who felt his blood run cold. "Commander." Roy's voice was barely a whisper, eyes locked on the tendrils that moved like snakes. "We need to—" The rest of his words were cut short as a second appendage lashed out, pulling him into the air like a rag doll. His screams rang in their calms until they cut off abruptly, leaving only the crackle of static and the sound of something wet splattering on the floor. Panic erupted. The remaining team scattered, instincts overtaking training. Keller's vision narrowed as he stumbled toward the nearest console, hoping to activate some defense, anything that could slow this nightmare. But the room had become a vortex of movement and noise, and that pulsing, insistent hum had grown deafening, pounding through his skull. Patel's lifeless body dropped to the ground with a thud, eyes wide and unseeing, as the creature turned its gaze on Keller. In that moment, he understood with horrifying clarity that they were not just intruders. They were prey, invited by the station itself, lured by its siren call into the cold, waiting maw of an alien god. The last thing Keller saw as the chamber's light faltered was the ripple of movement as the creature prepared to strike, eyes blinking in a pattern that spoke of hunger, intellect, and something far worse, satisfaction. The chamber erupted in chaos, a blur of screams and the sharp discharge of plasma shots that shattered the silence. Commander Reed Keller's vision swam as he stumbled backward, adrenaline numbing the edges of his shock. He barely registered the distant sound of Roy's final gurgled cry before it was cut off, leaving only static and the thumping of his heart in his ears. The alien creature reared, limbs unfurling in grotesque arcs that moved with an unsettling grace. Its countless eyes blinked in a wave, each one trained on the remaining crew. They reflected the blue luminescence of the glyphs etched into the walls, casting fractured beams of light across the room. The sight stirred something primal in Keller, a sense of profound, incomprehensible wrongness. "Fall back," he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the dense, vibrating hum that filled the chamber. It resonated deep within his chest, an invasive pulse that scrambled his thoughts. Patel's lifeless body lay sprawled nearby, eyes wide and glassy, a crimson halo pooling beneath her head. The rest of the crew moved as if underwater, movements sluggish with terror. Lieutenant Alvarez, the tactical officer, took aim with trembling hands, sweat beading on his brow. It won't go down. We need a plan, Keller. His voice was frantic, pitched higher than Keller had ever heard. A shot rang out, another bright burst of light that fizzled harmlessly against the creature's glossy hide. It turned toward Alvarez, limbs snapping into a taut readiness that made Keller's gut clench. The hum rose in pitch, shrill and unrelenting. It spoke to them now, not in words, but in sensation, fear, hunger, and a dark, gaping intelligence that had slumbered for untold eons. The creature shifted, revealing a pattern of larger eyes running down its spine, each one opening to reveal a swirling depth of cold, alien understanding. It knew them, not just as intruders, but as subjects in a study it had conducted countless times before. Suddenly, the lights in the chamber brightened to a blinding white, and the hum ceased, leaving a silence that rang louder than any noise. Keller squinted, heart thudding erratically, as the walls around them shifted and came alive. The glyphs, those strange carvings, moved, rearranging into forms that defied comprehension. They coalesced into symbols that glowed with a searing, unnatural intensity. "Commander," Alvarez said, voice barely a rasp. His eyes were wide, pupils shrunken to pinpricks. "Those symbols, they're changing." Keller's throat tightened as the realization dawned with cold, sinking clarity. The walls weren't just marked with the language of an ancient race. They were living records, chronicling the endless cycle of the station's history. The station had not been abandoned. It had been feeding, repeating this pattern over and over, luring explorers, researchers, wanderers, all bound by their insatiable curiosity. This chamber wasn't just a room. It was a trap, a hive mind, a living monument to the unknowable horror it housed. The creature moved again, slow and deliberate, its segmented limbs clicking like the legs of an enormous insect. Keller's legs were leaden, frozen by the realization that nothing they did would matter. No shot, no retreat, no plan could change their fate. The station's purpose was etched into its walls and whispered through the silent vastness of space. To lure, to devour, to persist. Alvarez broke the paralysis first, lunging for the exit, but a thin tendril shot out, coiling around his neck and yanking him back into the center of the room. He screamed, a sound so raw that Keller felt it pierce through his numbed senses, dragging him back to the horror unfolding before him. "Help me!" Alvarez clawed at the black, sinewy appendage as it tightened, lifting him off the ground. The creature's eyes shifted, observing him with a cold, almost clinical detachment. It pulled him closer, and the glyphs flared once more, as if in response to his final, desperate pleas. Keller couldn't look away as Alvarez's body convulsed, the life forced from him in a series of spasms that ended in a sickening snap. Suddenly, Keller's earpiece crackled, a sound that pulled him back from the brink of despair. "Commander, do you read? What's your status?" The voice was garbled, half lost to static. It was Lieutenant Daniels, the communications officer who had stayed aboard the Endeavor. The sound of her voice hit him like a lifeline. Keller swallowed, forcing air into his lungs. "Daniels, we're compromised. The station. It's a trap. Get ready to..." The earpiece went dead, the connection severed by the same oppressive force that made the room vibrate with unnatural energy. The creature's eyes were on him now, all of them, unblinking. They seemed to widen, their pale light intensifying as Keller's vision blurred, blackness creeping into the edges. A sound like a whisper rose, low and guttural. It bypassed his ears, burrowing into his mind. "You understand now. You are fuel. You are the next chapter. The walls around him rippled as the creature advanced, its presence filling the chamber with a suffocating inevitability. Keller's last thought, bitter and sharp, was that they had come seeking answers, driven by the explorer's curse, to push further, to know more, to step into the dark. The dark had answered, and now it would never let them go. The chamber was drenched in shadow, pulsating with a cold light that flickered as though alive. Commander Keller's knees buckled, the weight of the creature's gaze pressing down on him like the crushing depths of an ocean. Around him, the remains of his team lay scattered. Patel's lifeless stare, Roy's twisted form, Alvarez's frozen rictus of terror. They had come as explorers, driven by duty and the unyielding curiosity that marked humanity's quest for knowledge. Now they were little more than echoes of ambition snuffed out in an instant. The alien eyes blinked in an unspeakable pattern, their light stabbing into his mind, prodding and dissecting his will to resist. The creature loomed closer, an amalgam of sinew and eyes, exuding an intelligence that was older than any civilization he'd known, older than Earth itself. Keller's pulse quickened, a frantic drumming that matched the feverish rhythm of the station's hum. He wanted to move, to fight, to scream, but his body was frozen, rooted by the suffocating awareness that escape was beyond hope. The chamber had transformed, the once stationary glyphs now swirling in a symphony of alien script that spoke in vivid bursts of light. The story of the station unfolded before him, an ancient race, brilliant and doomed, creating this outpost as a last-ditch effort to contain the being now staring into his soul. They had failed, and now so had he. The voice returned, slithering through the marrow of his bones, bypassing ears and comprehension alike. You are the last. You are the bridge. Keller gasped as the glyphs flared to a blinding white, and the room seemed to peel away, not physically, but in a shift of reality itself. He was no longer standing on the cold metal floor, but floating in a void that breathed. Stars stretched into elongated, unfamiliar constellations, their light twisting as if trying to escape. The creature followed, dragging the chamber's essence with it, warping space around them. Suddenly he was outside himself, observing as the being coiled tighter, its appendages reaching not for his body but for his mind, the raw fabric of his being. Memories bled out of him like ink in water. Childhood mornings drenched in sunlight, the scent of the sea, the pride of his first mission. Each moment stripped away, examined and consumed. No, he whispered, or thought he did. The line between thought and sound was obliterated here, in this space where physics held no dominion. The glyphs that had surrounded him now etched themselves into his skin, branding his soul with the knowledge of countless victims before him. He was one with the station now, part of its relentless, hungry cycle. But beneath the horror, a deep, dark understanding bloomed. The station was not merely a prison, it was a weapon, a siren song designed to call life from the far reaches of the cosmos, feeding the creature's eternal hunger and transmitting the echoes of despair back into the void as a beacon. The last cycle begins with you, the voice intoned, and Keller felt himself fracture. His consciousness, his essence, began to spiral outward, melding with the station's eternal machinery. He could see the Endeavor now, a silver speck tethered outside, and knew that Daniels was aboard, watching, waiting for a signal that would never come. His voice was stolen, reduced to silence as he reached out in vain, the black tendrils of the creature tightening like a vice. And then, everything shifted. The chamber, the creature, the void. It all collapsed inward with a soundless roar. Keller's vision went dark as the creature's many eyes blinked shut, leaving him suspended in the vast nothingness, neither dead nor alive, but fused into the machine's endless, predatory existence. Daniels watched from the bridge of the Endeavor, her fingers drumming anxiously on the comms console. The silence from the station was absolute, oppressive. She activated the emergency beacon, eyes fixed on the looming structure that had swallowed her crewmates. The signal pulsed out once, then fell quiet. No answer came, only the cold, endless void staring back. In the deep black of space, the station's glyphs flickered one final time, a heartbeat of alien light. The hum returned, steady, patient, a prelude to its eternal task. And in that stillness where stars bore witness, the station resumed its call, the signal stronger now, reaching further, promising answers to those who would dare seek it. It would wait. It had all the time in the universe.